Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. With us today is Felice Gaer, Director of AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights and a leading expert on UN human rights mechanisms and religious freedom. Felice will assess the progress, potential, and enduring problems in the UN's effort to contribute to the fight against anti-Semitism. After we hear from Felice, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That is questions, plural. Felice, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dan. And thank all of you who joined this AJC briefing. So I'm Felice Gaer, Director of AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights. Now, the Jacob Blaustein Institute, which will celebrate its 50th anniversary next year, was established in memory of a past AJC president, Jacob Blaustein, who was an NGO consultant to the US delegation at the 1945 founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco. He and all of AJC played a pivotal role in persuading the US government and the rest of the nations assembled there to call for the UN Charter to include promotion and protection of human rights as one of the organization's key functions. Blaustein and AJC considered it essential that a multilateral organization founded on the ashes of the Holocaust and aimed at saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war should also be able to prevent the reemergence of cataclysmic anti-Semitic violence and hatred. And they succeeded in tasking the United Nations to protect human rights for all. Now, this year marks the United Nations 75th anniversary. The concept of human rights has surely transformed the global moral climate. But using the instrumentalities of the United Nations, well, to implement those rights in practice, it's had a checkered history. Anti-Semitism is only one of the human rights issues on which our institute has been active over the years. But we see the UN's ability to address it as a bellwether for the relevance and utility of the organization more broadly. So, is the UN an ally or an adversary when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism? Let me preview the conclusion that we've reached. Undoubtedly, over the years, we have seen and continue to see some states using UN mechanisms as a tool for promoting an anti-Semitic agenda. But we also see some glimmers of hope in intergovernmental bodies, and at the same time, key UN officials, leaders, and independent experts have stepped up and shown themselves willing to use their positions of influence to press the organization and to press governments to do more to stamp out anti-Semitic hate. We see the same pattern in the battle for the UN to play an effective role in human rights more broadly. And our view is that despite all the challenges, the UN must remain a key focus of our efforts to combat anti-Semitism. Why? Why the UN? Well, first, because anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that does not stop at national borders. Indeed, as it proliferates on social media, the reach of anti-Semites online is even more transnational. You've probably seen some of the disgusting images and messages blaming Jews for the COVID-19 crisis. The UN is multilateral, and it's global, and its reach is global. This is essential for addressing a phenomenon that is occurring not only in places with Jewish communities domestically that can advocate with their governments to do more to combat anti-Semitism, but also in places where Jewish communities are absent or are not able to advocate for change without risking serious retaliation. So in places like Iran or Indonesia, or even many European countries, the UN and its experts may be the only sources, other than ourselves, pressing for change on this. Second, why the UN? Because recognizing anti-Semitism as a source of human rights violations at the UN makes the point that governments have international legal obligations to take action to prevent anti-Semitic violence and discrimination, to protect vulnerable people, and to offer remedies to the victims. So it's not just a moral duty or something that might be nice. It's a legal obligation. And when UN sources recall this, they add legitimacy to our advocacy efforts to combat anti-Semitism. So what's the UN done that's problematic about anti-Semitism? Well, I'm sure many of you are well acquainted with the UN's poor record on anti-Semitism, particularly that of its intergovernmental bodies like the 193-member United Nations General Assembly or the 47-member Human Rights Council. These bodies have been unable to unambiguously condemn anti-Semitism. There's no standalone resolution critical of it or of specific anti-Semitic incidents. To make matters worse, sometimes state representatives use UN bodies to actively engage in anti-Semitism. There have been cases where state representatives at the UN expressly criticized the Jewish religion itself, though this has been relatively rare in recent years. Some governments have also sponsored and successfully secured adoption of UN resolutions and activities that reflect contemporary anti-Semitism in the way they characterize Israel and its actions. This has continued over the years. A few notorious examples come to mind. The 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution, the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, the 2009 Durban Review Conference, where Iran's President Ahmadinejad, repudiated in the UN for his Holocaust denial, denounced, quote, the pretext of Jewish suffering, unquote, and Jewish control of major parts of the world. More recently, we've seen that both the General Assembly and Human Rights Council adopt far more resolutions annually criticizing Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians than criticizing any other country in the world. And as Professor Erwin Kotler, a member of the Jacob Blaustein Institute Administrative Council and a former Minister of Justice of Canada, has remarked, the UN General Assembly has crossed a line into anti-Semitism in a number of cases when it's treated Israel, the only Jewish majority state, as the Jew among nations. This is in part a result of the geopolitical context in which Palestinians and their allies are more numerous and more actively seeking to advance their condemnatory agenda. And they do it in nearly every UN body, committee, and negotiation. And they're more actively seeking it than are Israel and its allies working to stop it. So that's the bad side of the story. But there's also some good news. Intergovernmental bodies have often been antagonists when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism. But as a result of committed diplomatic effort, particularly by the United States, Israel, and some of its friends, we have seen some progress in the UN's intergovernmental bodies. For example, the UN General Assembly has now held a series of informal meetings on anti-Semitism at the request of key member states, 2015, 2016, even just last June, 2019. These sessions have not resulted in the UN adopting resolutions on anti-Semitism, but they have clearly set the tone on the issue, a tone of concern and of condemnation. Also in the General Assembly, since 2003, there have been annual programs to commemorate the liberation of the Nazi death camps. and a year-round UN Holocaust Remembrance Unit was established. It provides important educational modules around the world, including training of UN personnel in numerous countries. And over the last decade, we've seen states raising concerns about ways to combat anti-Semitism in the context of conferences on best practices in fighting hate crimes and hate speech. Separately, and even more promisingly in recent years, a number of high-level UN figures acting independently from states have emerged as allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. First, there's been leadership from UN Secretaries General. As a result of interventions by the Jacob Blaustein Institute and others, Secretaries General since Kofi Annan have spoken out and criticized anti-Semitism. Annan called the Zionism is Racism resolution a low point for the UN. In 2015, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon warned that, quote, grievances about Israeli actions must never be used as an excuse to attack Jews, unquote. And current Secretary General Antonio Guterres has also been good. In 2017, he clearly affirmed that calling for the destruction of the state of Israel or denying its right to exist is, in fact, his words, modern day anti-Semitism. In early 2019, expressed support for the working definition on anti-Semitism. And last year, Guterres decided to make combating hate speech a key priority, and he has specifically referenced anti-Semitism in that context. Now, the Secretary General of the United Nations has limited power to affect the conduct of governments, but he can still have an important effect on the behavior of the rest of the organization and on states' conduct at the UN. Secretaries General can assert leadership to condemn anti-Semitism and also to call out inappropriate decisions or statements by member states. In this way, he asserts the Secretary General's moral authority, and he can also empower those pressing for change at the local level, particularly in democratic countries. Other high-level UN officials have shown themselves to be allies too. For example, increasingly, the Secretary General's Special Advisor on Genocide Prevention, who is also the point person for the UN Plan of Action Against Hate Speech, has spoken out against anti-Semitic hate speech and hate crimes. Last year, he warned Europeans that rising anti-Semitic political rhetoric there was reminiscent of the sort of hate speech that preceded the Holocaust. And 3 weeks ago, the Special Advisor made the first official UN statement specifically sounding the alarm about COVID-19 related hate speech and hate crimes. His office is raising specific concerns about anti-Semitism and the need to address it in their internal guidance for all UN personnel based worldwide. Now, in addition to the UN's professional leaders, there are also independent human rights mechanisms and bodies. They're appointed by states, but they have a high degree of autonomy. Some are called special rapporteurs. JBI has worked over the years to identify the most courageous and innovative of these human rights experts and to encourage them to take bold steps on human rights issues, including, but not limited to, anti-Semitism. Now, one such expert is the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. The official who's held this title for the last 3 years, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, is a former foreign minister of the Maldives. He's demonstrated an exceptional degree of understanding and commitment to making the UN more effective in the fight against anti-Semitism. We brought this issue to his attention when we organized an expert consultation on the UN's treatment of the issue of global anti-Semitism in Geneva in 2018. He was one of several top UN officials we invited to the meeting, where we introduced the working definition on anti-Semitism, presented recent data, and our concerns about governments and the UN's own role. At the end of the conference, Dr. Shaheed decried what he called, and I quote, a scandalous lack of attention by the United Nations human rights system to anti-Semitism, unquote. What's more, he pledged to change it. Now, those of us working in the context of the UN are accustomed to promises that aren't or can't be fulfilled. But Dr. Shaheed kept his promise. He convened meetings and consultations on anti-Semitism in numerous countries over the following year. And at his request, we convened a 2-day program on anti-Semitism in the United States. We also facilitated contacts for him with Jewish organizations from a number of countries, from Latin America to Indonesia, that otherwise wouldn't have been visited. Dr. Shaheed used this information to prepare a report, which he delivered 6 months ago to the UN General Assembly. In it, he identified rising anti-Semitism as a serious human rights problem with global scope. It actually called anti-Semitism a serious obstacle to the enjoyment of the right to freedom of religion and belief by Jews, and toxic to democracies. He noted its presence in countries with sizable Jewish communities and in those with little or no population. This was the first UN human rights report wholly dedicated to global anti-Semitism. And it looks further into the sources of anti-Semitism than any UN body has done previously. It clarifies that right-wing extremists are a source, but not the only source of contemporary anti-Semitic expression and acts. He cites left-wing sources and Islamic extremist ones as well. This was new. In the report, Dr. Shaheed also recommended that all UN member states adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism as a critical non-legal educational tool. No UN report has ever recommended this important step before. Dr. Shaheed also expressly noted that while the right to freedom of expression is vital, and here I quote, expression which draws on anti-Semitic tropes or stereotypes, or rejects the right of Israel to exist, or advocates discrimination against Jewish individuals because of their religion, should be condemned, unquote. Dr. Shaheed also called on states to prohibit the commission of anti-Semitic hate crimes and to identify, document, and monitor anti-Semitic incidents. He called on them to protect individuals at risk of violence and to create high-level focal points or envoys dealing with the problem of anti-Semitism. Now, the work of this important expert has begun to have an impact on other UN officials and bodies as well. The UN General Assembly, comprising all 193 member states, adopted a resolution noting Dr. Shaheed's report with appreciation and did this by consensus, no negative votes. Since Dr. Shaheed published his report, high-level UN officials have increasingly characterized anti-Semitism as a human rights violation, and they've amplified Dr. Shaheed's alarm about the dangers posed by rising anti-Semitism. We've seen other UN human rights experts actually paying attention to anti-Semitism. For example, in January this year, in a statement for Holocaust Remembrance Day, 9 UN human rights experts with very different mandates joined Dr. Shaheed in a statement that called for states to take urgent and effective steps to monitor anti-Semitic incidents, ensure accountability for perpetrators of violence, and protect Jewish individuals, communities, and sites as part of an effort to combat anti-Semitism. We're also seeing signs that Dr. Shaheed's advocacy will have an impact on the UN's response to the COVID-19 crisis. Just last Friday, which was, as I said earlier, the 6-month anniversary of his report to the General Assembly, Dr. Shaheed published an official UN statement warning about rising anti-Semitic rhetoric in the context of the COVID-19 crisis and calling for action to combat it. We've seen Jewish advocates and community representatives around the world increasingly citing his recommendations in their advocacy efforts as they seek to persuade governments to adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism in full. Indeed, Cyprus, Italy, Sweden, Uruguay, and Greece all have done so since he published his report. And we've seen Italy and Romania designate special envoys on anti-Semitism within their own governments since then. At this time, when the relationship between the US and the UN is particularly difficult, we've also seen doctors' report and recommendations endorsed by over 100 members of the US Congress who specifically called on Secretary General Guterres to act now to implement it. Jewish civil society representatives that were previously and justifiably skeptical about the value to be gained from raising concerns about anti-Semitism with UN human rights monitors have also expressed interest in increasing their engagement with UN mechanisms as a result of Dr. Shahid's report. So I return to the original question, whether the UN is an ally or an antagonist when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism. What we've seen suggests that the UN is and can be both. We agree with Dr. Shahid that its past record was scandalous, but in some respects, we hope we're now turning a corner. The UN is a complex entity. It's made up of representatives of states, independent experts, numerous sub-bodies, and a bureaucracy consisting of a Secretary General and thousands of staff members. Our experience is that the UN, when properly engaged by knowledgeable and able advocates, like the staff of the Jacob Blaustein Institute, can be an ally. But the rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric and incidents worldwide that we are seeing shows that there's plenty of room for more engagement. We're glad to have helped the Shahid report happen. We look forward to doing more. And now, Dan, let's open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Felice. Our first question comes from Rivka in Maryland. She asked, how does the UN fare on anti-Semitism in comparison to other religious freedom issues? Is the UN more vocal on the protection of Christians in Muslim majority countries or against Islamophobia, for example?
Well, the UN's action on religious freedom more generally has been limited, but it has been significant. Generally speaking, the UN has addressed religious freedom issues from the point of view of norms. When it comes to specific communities, it's focused in on beleaguered communities. I think everyone would agree that there's been a lot of attention to Muslim communities because Muslim states, Muslim majority states have raised these issues regularly, and they start with 56 members of the OIC who will echo those concerns. When it comes to other religious communities, whether we're talking about beleaguered Tibetans or Uyghur Muslims or Baha'is or Jews for that matter, the concern is less, but it does take place. It takes place in the form of statements. It takes place in the form of reports that may be written on these issues. We are concerned about issues of religious freedom worldwide. For if everyone had religious freedom, we wouldn't have to be spending our time worrying about anti-Semitism or any of these other concerns. But this is a quest we need to put more effort into.
Our next question comes from Candy Gould, who asks, in the light of our focus redirected on the coronavirus, do you think we will lose ground in the fight against anti-Semitism?
Well, I think I've just given an answer to that in my remarks. We've actually seen that there have been calumnies about Jews in the context of COVID-19, and they have been countered. Special Rapporteur last Friday issued a very strong statement condemning rising anti-Semitic rhetoric and calling on this to be taken down around the world when it appears. So I think the answer is we won't lose ground, but we need to fight to maintain ground.
We received similar questions from Susan in New York and Dale in Wisconsin, who ask, how do we reconcile the UN's clear history of anti-Israel bias and new efforts to take on anti-Semitism? Is this not an inherent contradiction? Is there an argument perhaps that we shouldn't be engaging at all?
I think if you heard my remarks, you would understand that engagement can have results. The lack of engagement, everyone will tell you, the lack of engagement, absence ensures that the opponents, that the haters have a free and clear field ahead of them. And believe me, when they do, they use it.
Eliana in Boston asked, to what extent has the power of the UN changed depending on the occupant of the Oval Office? How does that impact the work of JBI or AJC?
Every United Nations Secretary General has paid a lot of attention to the role of the United States. We're not only the host country for the United Nations headquarters, but we are also the largest financial contributor and the largest voluntary contributor of funds to the United Nations. It's difficult for the leader, the bureaucrat who is the head of the United Nations, to engage with a hostile United States. Easier to deal with a friendly United States. But what about the governments that are involved? Does that change when the occupant of the Oval Office changes? In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. So this is why the United States has a civil service and a foreign service and bureaucrats and people who are trained and skilled to work in these organizations, to work in other countries worldwide. And while policy may change with administrations, the sophistication with which you can pursue those policies in these organizations doesn't change. It needs to be stronger, in my opinion. There need to be more devoted to these issues. You can have more of an impact when you're engaged.
Our next question comes from Juliana in Washington, D.C. AJC called Ahmed Shahid's report historic. Can you speak to AJC's role in supporting the crafting of this report and share insight about what AJC has done and what JBI has done to urge implementation of Shahid's recommendations?
Well, Juliana, I described some of that in my remarks already, but I'll summarize it. We held an expert consultation in Geneva where we brought together the envoys on anti-Semitism from the European Union, the United States, other countries, where we brought expert monitors, people who do the statistical work and evaluation of incidents and of anti-Semitism in countries around the world, and where we brought ourselves and a number of specialists from the United Nations Human Rights section. The result of that led Dr. Shahid to call the UN work scandalous. It led the High Commissioner for Human Rights, High Commissioner Zaid, to say that he had been convinced that the UN's human rights program had underserved this issue in its work. And it led Shahid to decide to do a report. In the context of that report, we sent in some material based on the program we convened about the United States and anti-Semitism. And we shared some information from AJC about the working definition and its strengths and limitations as well. We will continue to encourage all the groups that we worked with to send materials to Dr. Shahid and to other UN mechanisms so that they can address these issues. To be very frank, after the Durban World Conference, Jewish organizations stopped sending material to the UN, stopped believing that their concerns would be heard. And this report really sends a different signal.
Our next question comes from Melanie Nelkin in Atlanta, Georgia. You mentioned that there has never been a standalone resolution against anti-Semitism at the UN. At a time when we find ourselves in a global pandemic, with a rise in anti-Semitism and hate speech against Chinese and Muslims who are being denied treatment in India, would this coming UNGA be a good time to propose a resolution? What state would be the best one poised to introduce such a resolution?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea. Thank you, Melanie, for raising this point. I cited it because we've seen resolutions on many other kinds of issues. And it's often a bellwether of the degree of concern. But the gremlins who wordsmith UN resolutions are out there, and they have not been, and they have undermined every effort to have such a resolution. In 2001, the Irish tried to have a resolution like that. They swore, they promised that that resolution would be adopted, and it didn't happen. They worked for months and months. It didn't happen, and they ended up withdrawing it. I don't think it would happen now. I think that right now, in the course of the global pandemic that we're in the middle of, that we probably should do a little more work on dealing with specific incidents before we ask the General Assembly to come back with a resolution. After all, there are rhetorical resolutions and there are operational resolutions. And right now, what we want to see is operational action. The Secretary General is proposing that with his action plan against hate speech and hate crimes. And the human rights experts are also in a position to make recommendations like Dr. Shahid did about adopting the working definition, about appointing special envoys, about conducting education, and about holding perpetrators accountable. These are all operational measures that need to be in greater force before we ask for something rhetorical.
Our next question comes from Stanley in Beacon, New York. What would be your ultimate desired outcome beyond the recent progress you described, demonstrating success regarding the UN and combating anti-Semitism? A new body, a resolution?
What is success? It's a good question, Stanley. I think success is seeing more attention by special experts. I think success is seeing awareness when something like the really ugly denunciation of Jews that we're seeing around the world right now during the COVID crisis is ongoing. Hearing public officials speak out against this, seeing private companies take down these things, ban the selling of the protocols, as has recently taken place, finally. Those are successes. The United Nations is a boost to these when it calls out incidents of anti-Semitism. But it's not a global government, and it can't go and tell everybody exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. So success is speaking out against silence in a way that can bolster these national and domestic efforts.
We have a question from Evelyn Leopold, who's asking, has any country at the United Nations, aside from Iran, engaged in Holocaust denial actions?
You know, Iran's actions were so atrocious and offensive particularly when Ahmadinejad was president, that the Secretary General not only called it out, but the Security Council issued a statement that denial of the Holocaust and plain fact and historical facts like this is unacceptable. So that's the, what should we say? They've been horrific in that regard. But in earlier years, there were a number of other countries. I actually drew up a list that engaged in a variety of slurs, but not in outright Holocaust denial in the bodies of the United Nations. Since the strong response of Kofi Annan and the Secretary General to Ahmadinejad, those words aren't spoken in the UN. There are plenty of other words that are spoken. We still get criticism, for example, of the concept of the chosen people, where I've heard with my own ears a number of representatives of Arab states coming forward and criticizing this as being parallel to concepts of racial superiority, and the like, not recognizing that this is about responsibility, chosen to have certain responsibilities, not to be privileged or superior in any way. We still hear that. Because the United Nations has had these annual Holocaust Remembrance programs, which are really quite moving and impressive events, because of that, I think that the states that might learn about these things at home or engage in Holocaust denial at home, which there are many, I think that they have been intimidated into keeping their mouths shut. And when I say intimidated, I mean by the truth, by the reality, by the facts, by the historical presence in these meetings of Holocaust survivors, veterans, and others. To a certain extent, it's brought a balance on this issue, and has been very helpful in promoting understanding, and of course, providing the ability to stop, to work to prevent genocide, all genocides.
Our next question comes from Hadassah in New Jersey. She asked, there was significant controversy over the release of a blacklist of companies operating in the West Bank. This feels like textbook anti-Semitism, as no such list exists for other countries with territorial disputes. Can you comment on this and give us some insight into the dynamics of this decision and its aftermath?
Thank you, Hadassah. This was a decision in 2016 at the Human Rights Council, the year the United States was not a member of the council. What was asked was that a list of corporations conducting business in the occupied territories be drawn up by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. From 2016 till just a couple of months ago, we were told that it was in progress. There was no further action, but it was published. Such a list was published after going back and forth to all relevant companies. It involved mentioned companies in about 6 countries, a handful in the United States. Most of them, of course, were Israeli companies of all kinds. This has been done in the context of, I think it was Myanmar, in a very different way and in a different context of genocide. That this was something that the Human Rights Council did and asked for and received has been considered something that fits the categories that Dr. Shahid wrote about. He said when a decision moves into an area where it provokes a common trope of anti-Semitism or asks something of Israel that's not being done of any other country in the world, it can be called anti-Semitic. Now, the reaction to this so-called list has focused on the fact that, or hasn't focused enough on the fact that from 1945 onward, the Arab League imposed a boycott on Israel and on any country doing business with Israel. This lasted for decades, and it was only in the aftermath of Oslo that it ended. Most people see and this was 1945, before the State of Israel was even created. In that context, it was opposed clearly to the right of Israel to exist. It was trying to destroy the state. In that context, the blacklist, so-called, by the Human Rights Council, looks to Jews and Jewish organizations and Israelis and American officials and others who have criticized it. It looks to be something designed and focused on eradicating the State of Israel altogether. To some, it's just a list of companies. To others, it's about the existence of the State of Israel. Because of that, it's been denounced, and it should be denounced.
Our last question comes from Ann Myers in Cleveland. She asked, are there particular places in the world that AJC, JBI would consider the next hotbed of actions extremely threatening to their Jewish communities? If so, are there any actions we can advocate for the UN can and should take?
Thank you, Anne. We've got a long list of countries where there are problems. Many of them are in Europe. Others, we can't get away from the fact that the violence in the United States. Yes, we've had attacks and killings in Toulouse and Brussels and Hanau in Germany. But we've had murders in synagogues in Poway, in Pittsburgh, wasn't in the synagogue, but in Monsey and in Jersey City. Again, didn't make it to the synagogue, but that was right next door. So we've got to look here. We've got to look elsewhere. Dr. Shahid points to problems as far away as Venezuela, countries without Jews like Iran. Well, they have Jews, but it's a dwindling community there. Turkey. We have, a lot of places that are having problems and that we need to focus on. And read the report. You can find it on the, if you go on the AJC homepage and you go down to the bottom on the right, there's a human rights box. Click on the item on the bottom. It'll take you to something about Dr. Shahid's report and a link to his report. Read it, you'll see just how global this problem is.
Thank you, Felice, and that's, yes, ajc.org. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. To support AJC's vital work around the world, please visit ajc.org/donate. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. Goodbye.